During the annual summit in Brazil, the BRICS bloc issued a joint statement where a range of critical points were made on global affairs. The joint declaration underscores the fact that the Global South is very much aligned, despite what Western propaganda media tries to tell us on some of the key issues and developments in international relations. The joint declaration, which I'm about to walk you through in this video, proves it. Of course, nations disagree, and they don't have to align on every single policy decision. They face their own challenges, but the fact that they do see eye to eye on some of the most pivotal moments, some of the most critical issues, that to me is very telling. That speaks volumes.
Multipolarity is not a choice, but an objective reality. It's coming to replace the old neoliberal model, which is outdated, which was based on neo-colonial practices.
So in this video, I will walk you through the key takeaways from the BRICS declaration. First, the BRICS nations underscore their full support for a Palestinian state on 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as capital, and the BRICS bloc called all parties for an unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. BRICS expresses their deep concern over ongoing Israeli attacks on Gaza and the blockade of humanitarian aid. The bloc calls for full adherence to international law and an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, withdrawal of Israeli forces, and release of hostages, as well as unhindered aid delivery. It reaffirms support for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees and the Palestinian right to self-determination, stressing the need to unify Gaza and the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. Forced displacement is firmly rejected by the BRICS bloc. So BRICS backs a two-state solution, in other words, based on 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as Palestine's capital, and it urges the international community to support Palestinian statehood and reconstruction efforts. Now, when was the last time that we heard anyone here in the United States or the West more broadly call for adherence to international law when it comes to Israel's actions in the Middle East and more specifically in Gaza? All right, let's move on. BRICS also condemns U.S. protectionism, or tariffs in other words, and joined U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran. More specifically, talking about tariffs, BRICS opposes the rising trade restrictive and unilateral measures such as tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and protectionism disguised as environmental policy, which threaten global trade, supply chains, and economic stability. The bloc reaffirmed its commitment to a fair, rules-based multilateral trading system centered on the WTO with special provisions for developing countries. It calls for urgent reform of the World Trade Organization, including the restoration of its dispute settlement system, which we know doesn't really work very well. BRICS also condemns unilateral coercive measures and economic sanctions not authorized by the UN Security Council, citing their harmful impacts on human rights, on development, and global equity, and calls for their immediate elimination. The third key takeaway is the demand for Israel to withdraw from occupied Syrian territory. BRICS supports Syria's sovereignty and a UN-led inclusive political process under Resolution 2254. It condemned all violence, terrorist acts by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and the presence of foreign fighters. The bloc welcomed the lifting of unilateral sanctions to aid Syria's recovery, and it strongly urged Israel to end its occupation of Syrian territory in line with international law. Now, when it comes to Syria, there's a lot going on, and I'm not going to get into the specifics, but I will say that al-Shara, who is the present leader of Syria, is a former ISIS and Al-Qaeda leader with a $10 million bounty, previously groomed by Western powers. So during the summit in Brazil, the BRICS bloc also condemned ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Salafi terror attacks in Syria. And I think that goes a long way because the BRICS bloc acknowledges the role of foreign nations and foreign actors in Syria's tragic fate. Now, what's really interesting is that the bloc condemned Ukraine's attacks on civilian trains in Kursk, in Voronezh, and in Bryansk regions in May and in June of this year. Lastly, the BRICS bloc formally welcomed Indonesia as a new BRICS member. Southeast Asia, as you may know, has become an important development trajectory for the global south. BRICS recognizes Belarus, Bolivia, Kazakhstan, Cuba, Nigeria, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Uganda, and Uzbekistan as BRICS partner countries. This marks a significant expansion of the bloc's global engagement and strengthening its partnership across multiple regions. Now, very briefly, I want to emphasize the importance of Southeast Asia for the bloc's future. The 2025 BRICS Summit in Rio marks a pivotal moment for the Global South, particularly for Southeast Asia, as the bloc expands and evolves into a credible platform for strategic and economic cooperation. With countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam engaging as members or partners, the region sees BRICS as a way to ensure long-term stability and sovereignty. The new development bank and the contingent reserve agreement, which I discussed in great detail in a previous video, offer practical alternatives to Western-led financial institutions, appealing to nations who see diversification rather than alignment with any one power as their main goal at the moment. BRICS also provides a degree of geopolitical flexibility amid rising US-China tensions. Of course, challenges do remain, and that could be related to China's role within the bloc, which is seen as a threat by the United States. Of course, there is that unresolved South China Sea disputes and risks to ASEAN unity. Malaysia, as ASEAN chair, is already balancing this complex terrain, even as the United States threatens tariffs under renewed Trump-era policies. So while full ASEAN membership in BRICS is unlikely at this point in time, individual nations are quite clearly and steadily increasing engagement with the BRICS alliance, not as a rejection of the West, by the way, but as a strategic hedge. Ultimately, Southeast Asia's involvement signals a broader shift. The Global South is stepping forward, asserting agency in global affairs, and using BRICS not to choose sides, but to expand choices and to reclaim sovereignty in an increasingly polarized and fragmented world. Now, show your support. It goes a long way. Subscribe, like, and share. Support my work on Substack and Patreon. You will see more content on those platforms. I would love to see all of you there. And I will see you back here tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.